reported back when he received
Cape
good
Canaveral,
wishes. Thank you very
Florida,
much. We know it's
July
a good
1969. 3 men set off on one of the greatest adventures in
flight.
human history. Their goal?
11.
The moon.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12,
Hundreds of thousands were there to watch.
10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
The Cold War was in full swing, and the competition between the US and the Soviet Union extended even to space. On July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on Earth's only permanent satellite.
The 11 footpaths are only it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This event would bring Armstrong fame that he had never sought, and it would also change his life forever. Neil Armstrong became a living legend in the history of space travel, like a 20th century Christopher Columbus. But at the height of his popularity, he voluntarily withdrew from public life. Armstrong served as a Navy pilot during the Korean War. In 1955, he signed on with the government's high-speed flight station at Edwards Air Force Base in California. His first job was piloting chase planes during tests of experimental aircraft. The flight station was home to some of the country's best airmen. They had the right stuff, a combination of bravery and machismo that drove them to take on dangerous missions with aircraft that were still in the development stage. Armstrong's interest in aircraft dates back to his early childhood. He and his father once took a ride in a Ford Trimotor, known as the Tin Goose. They also attended local air shows together. Armstrong knew from the very start that he wanted to be a pilot. Later, he worked various jobs to earn money for flying lessons, and earned a student flight certificate on the day he turned 16. He also made his first solo flight later that month. In 1947, Armstrong enrolled at Purdue University and studied aeronautical engineering. His tuition was paid for by a federal program. In return, after graduation, he was required to complete 3 years of training and service in the US Navy. Afterward, Armstrong returned to Purdue, earning a degree in aeronautical engineering in January 1955. A year later, Armstrong married Janet Sheeran, whom he'd met at Purdue. He wasn't yet thinking about space travel. He was now starting a career as a test pilot. In October 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the first satellite, called Sputnik. At that time, many in the West believed that the USSR was technologically backward, but the launch of Sputnik changed all of that. And the Soviets successfully tested their first intercontinental ballistic missile in 1957, a cause of concern for the West. The U.S. responded by setting up a civilian space program, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Among the agency's missions, to put an astronaut into space. NASA chose a number of experienced test pilots to take part in the program. Meanwhile, Neil Armstrong continued his career as a project pilot. He flew a wide variety of aircraft, including the famous X-15 series. These were experimental rocket-powered aircraft that could fly faster than the speed of sound. They often reached altitudes of more than 80 kilometers, just short of the technical definition of outer space. Armstrong was an excellent pilot, but led an unassuming private life. He and his family lived in a home in the mountains of Southern California, with no electricity or hot water. His colleagues described him as friendly but reserved. He preferred to let his talents as a pilot speak for themselves. In the early 1960s, few thought that a manned spacecraft to the moon was possible. And the US space program was about to be outdone, again, by the Soviet Union. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to journey into outer space. Gagarin's capsule made a single orbit around the Earth and then returned. But as Gagarin was being celebrated worldwide as the first man in space, the US was putting the final touches to its own inaugural spaceflight. The next month, former Navy aviator and test pilot Alan Shepard took off from Cape Canaveral.
This is Freedom 7.
It was only a 15-minute flight.
What a beautiful view.
Shepard did not orbit the Earth as Gagarin had done. After the flight, his space capsule splashed down as planned off the coast of Bermuda. Shepard's successful flight prompted President John F. Kennedy to make a bold proposal.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
In February 1962, the USA launched its third manned spaceflight. The pilot was John Glenn, an experienced Marine Corps aviator and a veteran of the Advanced Aircraft Testing Program. Washington spared no expense in its competition with Moscow to conquer space.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
NASA officials started making crew assignments for future missions to the moon. This program was called Apollo. Among the candidates were James Lovell, James McDivitt, John Young, and Frank Borman. In June 1962, Neil Armstrong applied to become an astronaut. At this point in his life, Armstrong was trying to cope with a very serious personal tragedy. His 2-year-old daughter, Karen, died of a brain tumor in January 1962. Armstrong dealt with his grief by working harder than ever before. On September 17, 1962, Armstrong was introduced as one of the 9 new NASA astronauts. He was one of 2 civilians in the group. The rest were active military pilots. These men would take part in the Gemini program, which would feature a 2-man spacecraft. That same evening, Armstrong's parents, Viola and Stephen, were special guests on a popular TV quiz program.
If it turns out that your son is the first man to land on the moon, how will you feel?
Well, I guess I just say God bless him, and I wish him the best of all good luck.
God bless you.
The new astronauts began a rigorous training program. On board a modified Air Force jet, they tried to cope with the effects of weightlessness. The astronauts were pushed to their limits of their endurance, because no one knew what dangers they might face in space. It was a case of learning by doing.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
To help achieve this goal, the US space program developed the world's most powerful rocket, and did it without the use of sophisticated computers.
When I started in 1962, I had an adding machine on my desk. Just a normal adding machine with a crank. But we used it to calculate trajectories. We prepared complex tables and then fill them in.
The engineers were now in uncharted territory. No one had ever attempted a manned flight to the moon before. They had to design everything from scratch. The astronauts, including Neil Armstrong, became America's new heroes. Armstrong was no stranger to personal bravery. In the spring of 1964, Armstrong's house caught fire in the middle of the night, but he managed to rescue both his young sons. $400,000 were now working on the Moon project. The next step would be to develop the Gemini two-man spacecraft.
Ignition start. Liftoff.
The astronauts also practiced for spacewalks. But here, too, they were playing catch-up with the Russians. A cosmonaut made the first spacewalk in March 1965. The astronauts worked on docking maneuvers involving two spacecraft. The U.S. did this successfully for the first time in late 1965. The space program encountered several setbacks, but learned from its mistakes. Ocean landings proved especially difficult at first. In March 1966, Neil Armstrong and David Scott took off on a mission that was marked by both success and failure. The astronauts planned to dock their Gemini capsule with an unmanned target vehicle. Their first task was to rendezvous with the vehicle.
Feeling great. How about you?
After the astronauts carried out the docking procedure successfully, they noticed that one of the capsule's thrusters had become stuck in the on position, which was causing the spacecraft to rotate at high speed. Armstrong managed to steady the spacecraft, and then decided to abort the mission immediately. The capsule landed safely in the Pacific Ocean, southeast of Japan. The Gemini 8 mission was a major disappointment for the U.S., but NASA was still determined to win the space race.
Was there a political aspect to your work back then?
We were very aware of the competition.
Uns war dieser Konkurrenzkampf sehr bewusst. Die Amerikaner, die waren da weit im Hintertreffen. Aber wir haben dann versucht, natürlich diesen Abstand wettzumachen. Das war schon ein toller Wettbewerb und wir hatten auch durchaus großen Respekt voreinander.
The U.S. was now preparing for the first flight of the Apollo program, which featured a three-man crew. But the mission would end with the deaths of 3 astronauts. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. During a launch test in January 1967, a fire broke out in the capsule's cabin and spread quickly. All 3 astronauts were killed. NASA blamed the fire on deficiencies in capsule design, workmanship, and quality control. The agency made improvements to the spacecraft and to operational procedures. Meanwhile, NASA continued to experiment with using parachutes to return Apollo capsules safely to Earth. A more difficult challenge was the design and construction of the vehicle that would actually land the astronauts on the surface of the moon. Armstrong took part in flight tests of early versions of the lunar module. Armstrong took part in flight tests of early versions of the lunar module. Some of the astronauts called it the flying bedstead. The module suffered from a number of technical problems at the start. In May 1968, Armstrong was at the controls when the craft started to spin out of control. Armstrong ejected safely with just seconds to spare. But time was running out for NASA to meet President Kennedy's call to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. In December 1968, the Apollo 8 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, took off from the new Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
But 1968 was a turbulent year. The war in Vietnam was raging. Young people held anti-war protests across the country. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then, on Christmas Eve 1968, the world heard a voice from space. A voice that carried a message of peace and reconciliation.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
In December 1968, Neil Armstrong was appointed commander of the Apollo 11 mission. But the lunar lander still needed work. In May 1969, the crew of Apollo 10 took part in a dress rehearsal for the moon mission. The astronauts tested all the equipment and procedures that would be involved in an actual landing. The flight that would place astronauts on the surface of the moon, Apollo 11, was now just 2 months away. Armstrong was under enormous pressure, as he revealed in a 2010 interview.
Dieser Satz von Ende der Dekade, das schwirrte ständig um uns herum. Ja, das echote hin und her durch die Räume. Ende der Dekade. Das war der Grund, warum wir so einen kompakten Zeitplan hatten.
The USSR was also working hard to put a man on the moon. Alexei Leonov, an experienced cosmonaut, was chosen to command the first lunar landing mission. The Soviets had been carrying out tests of the huge N-1 rocket that would carry the crew into space. But in July 1969, during a test launch, the latest version of the rocket exploded shortly after liftoff. Meanwhile, in the US, NASA sought to personalize the space program by publishing photos of the astronauts with their families. As the scheduled date of the moon launch approached, people around the world found a new interest in space. Huge crowds gathered around the launch site. The visitors were in a festive mood. On July 16th, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins made their final preparations. Perhaps it was appropriate that a reclusive engineer, not a dashing Air Force pilot, should be the first man to set foot on the moon. His name was Neil Alden Armstrong. Shortly after 7 in the morning, the 3 astronauts headed for the launch pad. Armstrong, the mission commander, and pilot Buzz Aldrin will attempt the landing. Michael Collins will stay on board the command module as it continues to orbit the moon.
30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report
It's now been 8 years and 2 months since President Kennedy gave the order.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15
Among those
seconds.
viewing the
Guidance
launch is
internal.
former President Lyndon Johnson.
12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The Saturn V was the first U.S. rocket that was designed and built exclusively for space flights, even though it was originally proposed as a launch vehicle for military satellites. The astronauts' families followed the flight on TV.
Let me try auto again now, see what happens.
Suddenly, the module's guidance computer set off several alarms, but it turned out to be nothing serious.
We got good data. Over.
We all feared the worst, but a mission control technician who'd seen this problem before told the crew to ignore the computer and keep going.
Armstrong noticed that the lander was headed for a rocky area, so he took evasive action.
Armstrong stepped on the gas and flew the module like a helicopter, knowing full well that he was running out of fuel. We held our breath as the reports came in. 60 seconds of fuel left, then 30.
Armstrong kept his nerve and landed the module safely.
30 seconds. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I heard the whole thing. Well, good show. Tranquility.
Armstrong and Aldrin were now scheduled to sleep for a few hours. But instead, they started making preparations for leaving the lander and stepping onto the moon's surface.
More than anything else.
Das, woran ich mehr als an alles andere gedacht habe, ist, dass ich gesagt habe, das wäre jetzt der absolut falsche Moment, einen Fehler zu machen.
Back on Earth, an estimated 600 million people were following these events on live TV.
There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail.
Before he left the module, Armstrong took a bag of garbage that had piled up in the cabin and tossed it out the door.
Okay, we can verify the position, the opening I ought to have on the camera.
It took 15 minutes for Armstrong to climb down the ladder's 9 steps.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Armstrong's first step on the moon just lasted a few seconds. Then, he jumped back onto the ladder.
Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. Pretty good little jump.
Armstrong stepped down again, this time with his left foot. Mission Control gave Aldrin instructions on how to use the camera.
Buzz, this is Houston. F2, 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera. Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Armstrong stepped away from the ladder and turned toward the camera.
I'm going to step off the lamb now.
Then, he spoke the words that would go down in history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The scene was filmed by a camera attached to the outside of the lander.
There are 2 of them up here.
While he was climbing down, Neil pulled a lever that opened a storage bin, which contained a black and white TV camera. That's how we got to see him climbing down the ladder. Armstrong was now the star of the first live global TV broadcast.
I could look up and see the planet Earth, and it was very bright and very beautiful and very small.
The whole world was watching. The moon landing was not broadcast in the USSR. In 2010, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov described his reaction to Armstrong's historic achievement.
I crossed my fingers and wished him all the best. It was dangerous and I knew what could have gone wrong. But he did his job brilliantly.
20 minutes after Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin climbed down the ladder. Armstrong took photos of his colleague at this turning point in the history of space travel.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Armstrong and Aldrin then examined the lunar lander for possible damage. They also set up equipment to measure the moon's exact distance from the Earth and to study lunar earthquakes.
It's even perhaps easier than the simulations of 1/6G.
The astronauts climbed back into the lunar module, closed the hatch, and sealed it.
Simulations on the ground.
While they were moving around inside, Buzz Aldrin created a serious technical problem.
Walk around.
His backpack bumped into the ignition switch for the ascent engine and broke it off.
Buzz Aldrin used a felt tip pin to activate the mechanism. Before they re-entered the lunar module, Armstrong and Aldrin left behind a commemorative plaque.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
During their 2.5 hours on the moon's surface, the astronauts put up an American flag.
How is the quality of the TV? Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
President Richard Nixon phoned the crew with a special message.
For people all over the world, I am sure they too join with us in recognizing what an immense feat this is. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
Once they were back on board, they reopened the hatch and tossed out their backpacks, gloves, and boots. They left all that stuff behind to reduce the weight of the lander before liftoff.
They also had placed a golden olive branch on the moon's surface and a medal honoring cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Armstrong and Aldrin spent a total of nearly 22 hours on the moon. As the lander module took off, the powerful exhaust from the engines blew down the American flag that the astronauts had put up. The mission had gone well so far, but the White House had already prepared a statement in case something went seriously wrong.
They had already written a speech for Nixon to read to the American people if the astronauts had not been able to return to Earth, for whatever reason. Nixon actually recorded the speech in advance. He mourned the loss of the crew and promised that America's exploration of space would continue.
3 teams of astronauts had trained for the first moon mission. If Apollo 11 had failed, a backup crew would try a second launch.
We would have put astronauts on the moon in 1969 in any case. Fortunately, we got it right the first time.
Calculations of 5:51, which was the time planned.
8 days after the Apollo 11 crew began their mission, they returned safely to Earth. The capsule splashed down on the morning of July 24th in the Pacific Ocean, around 1,200 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. The crew was picked up by a Navy helicopter and then taken to an aircraft carrier that was waiting nearby. Mission accomplished. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins then walked to a mobile quarantine facility where they would spend the next 3 weeks. President Nixon arrived to greet the astronauts personally. They had to stay in quarantine because NASA was concerned that they might have brought back pathogens from the lunar surface.
Waving to the crowd of cheering sailors, moving swiftly into the mobile quarantine facility.
On August 13th, New York welcomed the astronauts with one of the biggest parades in the city's history. Armstrong said later that it was not important for him to be first on the moon. It was more important for him to return from the moon safely. Over the next 3 years, there were 6 more Apollo missions, but none generated as much excitement as Apollo 11 did. The astronauts' newfound fame was often hard for them to handle. Neil Armstrong in particular was annoyed by all the fuss. Still, the Apollo crew traveled the world and were given a warm welcome wherever they went. During a visit to Germany, Armstrong was surrounded by reporters and fans. Armstrong would now have more time to pursue his passion for flying gliders. He resigned from NASA in 1971. That same year, he joined the faculty of the University of Cincinnati as a professor of aeronautical engineering. He was already serving on the board of directors for several companies and continued to do so for the next 20 years. Armstrong resigned from the university in 1980. Armstrong now lived in a small town in Ohio, where he was born. But even there, he couldn't escape his fame. In 2005, he found out that his barber had sold some of his hair trimmings to a collector. Armstrong was angry and ordered the barber to donate the proceeds to charity, which he did. In 1989, the Apollo 11 crew traveled to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony to mark the 20th anniversary of their flight. In the 1970s, Buzz Aldrin had battled both depression and alcohol addiction. In 2002, Aldrin was involved in an altercation with a conspiracy theorist who claimed that the moon landing had been filmed at a Hollywood studio.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, I've ever thought of saying I misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief and a thief and a thief.
Neil Armstrong took a lighthearted approach to such claims. At the Golden Camera Award ceremony in Berlin in 1999, he was honored for starring in the first live worldwide TV program, The Moon Landing.
Erstens meinem Kostümbildner. Er hat dafür gesorgt, dass ich gut aussah, unerkennbar war und am Leben blieb. Und ich möchte auch meine Mannschaft in Erinnerung rufen. 300.000 Menschen und mehr, die zusammengekommen sind, um die größte Show überhaupt zu produzieren. Und schließlich, aber sicherlich am wichtigsten, möchte ich meinen Produzenten danken, die uns das Privileg ermöglicht haben, unsere Szenen am Originalschauplatz zu drehen.
Armstrong married his second wife, Carol, in 1994. Few believe the conspiracy theories anymore. Space probes that mapped the lunar surface in 2011 and 2012 found all sorts of evidence that Apollo astronauts had indeed been there. The landing site of Apollo 12. Footprints left by the Apollo 14 crew. Lunar rover vehicles used during the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions, and their tracks. Scientific equipment that the astronauts had set up. And of course, the site where Neil Armstrong first set foot on the moon's surface. In 2009, President Obama and the astronauts marked the 40th anniversary of the moon landing.
I grew up in Hawaii, as many of you know, and I still recall sitting on my grandfather's shoulders when those capsules would land in the middle Pacific and they'd get brought back, and we'd go out and we'd pretend like they could see us as we were waving at folks coming home.
At another ceremony, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. Neil Armstrong died on August 25, 2012, after undergoing heart surgery at the age of 82. People around the world mourned the loss of a man who had flown to the moon, but kept his feet planted firmly on the ground. Armstrong's cremated remains were scattered at sea by a Navy honor guard. He summed up his historic achievement with a few simple words.
In my own view, the important achievement of Apollo was a demonstration that humanity is not forever chained to this planet.
If astronauts ever return to the moon, or even if they travel to Mars, they will carry with them the memory of Neil Alden Armstrong.